Welcome into the Take the North podcast presented by Odyssey. I am Dan Wiederer, pleased today to be joined by a very special guest. He is friend of the Take the North podcast. He is Chicago Sun-Times sports writer. He is, most importantly, the 2024 Illinois Sports Writer of the Year as named by the National Sports Media Association. Mark Potash, how are we doing?
I'm doing great, Dan. How are you?
I was expecting you to take a bow there. That's a pretty big honor that you've added to the collection here recently. Let's give a little bow for the presence of greatness that we've brought onto the pod here.
I appreciate it, and it is quite an honor. I'm really bad at victory laps. Leave that to the CHGO guys.
And that's why we have you on here. That's why we have you on here, because we like your comedic wit.
But I am. It's an honor for me. Just as long as you brought it up, because as I've said before, I'm kind of a grinder in our business. Not the kind of guy who usually gets honors like that. So it's kind of a almost like a lifetime achievement award kind of thing for me. So I feel I'm very honored that people thought to nominate me and vote for me, I guess.
Yeah, you had my vote in that very specific election. And I do want to take people behind the curtain, because at Halas Hall for the last, I guess, 12 seasons now, you are the closest cubicle to me. We don't sit next to each other. There's a little walkway between us. Your back and my back are sort of each other, but it creates conversation. We've had many conversations over 12 years. And the thing I always miss in the month of late January and February is that withdrawal of the daily banter that we have in that corner of the media room. And so it's good to have you here on the virtual chatter to feed my fix a little bit.
Well, thanks, Dan. Usually probably by about August 1st, you're probably tired of me. So it kind of balances out.
I'd say, if we're being honest, I'd say probably October 1st I get tired of you. But then by November 1st, I'm right back into it for the finishing kick of whatever season we're covering.
That's when the 10-game losing streak started. What a season.
We've been through quite a few of them. And so we'll get to that in a little bit. And we'll get to some of the things that are going on with the Bears. But we have to start today's episode with a little remembrance of Virginia McCaskey, the Bears principal owner, team matriarch, passed away Thursday at the age of 102. That's the first thing that jumps out to me is 102, a life well lived, a life embraced. And when you look at it through a Bears lens, this is a woman who has direct lineage to the start of the league, the daughter of George Halas, and was alive for 1,450 Chicago Bears games. Like that is astounding when you wrap your brain around that. But I was curious what your initial thoughts and reflections were on Thursday when you learned of Mrs. McCaskey's
passing.
It's
interesting. It's a sad day when anybody passes, especially somebody as great as Virginia McCaskey. But 102 and like you said, what a wonderful life she lived. So when you say like a celebration of life, this is a life definitely that everybody will celebrate right away. And I'm a huge, many people who know me, I'm a huge history buff. I love any American history, sports history, especially any direct link to the Bears. The founding of the Bears, George Halas, is just sacred to me. And so she's always been very special. Can't say I knew Virginia, but only in passing a few times. But wow, what a wonderful woman! What a great representative for the Bears and the league. And frankly, she was the beloved matriarch of an ownership that's not very beloved. And so I think she was kind of had special status as somebody you really believed in and liked. And something that's interesting, Dan, the Bears' success has mostly been of a Halas route. George Halas and Muggs Halas were the ones who brought in Jim Finks and Mike Ditka that led to the Super Bowl. And it was Virginia who fired her son, basically, Mike, that brought in Ted Phillips and got them, got Jerry Angelo and Lovie Smith and out of that Super Bowl. So you could argue that every Super Bowl, every championship the Bears have ever won has been of a purely Halas route. And so now the Bears no longer have that. And, now it'll be interesting to see what happens.
In some of the written reflection that I'm doing for the Chicago Tribune, it is difficult at times to kind of honestly but gracefully acknowledge the sustained failure of the Bears over the last 30 or 40 years in a way that is still respectful of Virginia and her place in this organization. You talk about being a historian, and like me, I imagine you're a little bit of a pack rat, and I know you have articles and artifacts from newspapers and things from many years past, and so it's really easy to appreciate all that Mrs. McCaskey witnessed. And a previous version of this podcast, you may remember a little podcast called Bear Download, which had our good friend Rich Campbell as the co-host. In 2019, we had the opportunity for 25 minutes in Phoenix leading into the Bears 100th season to have Virginia McCaskey on as a podcast guest. Yesterday, I was searching for that podcast in all of the online podcast archives. It is gone. Luckily, on a hard drive deep in my office, I found the 25-minute recording. And Potsy, it was so cool to go back and listen to that, because it was this sort of like time travel through Bears history through the eyes of someone who lived all of it. And that's what struck me. Like Virginia McCaskey was 3 years old riding the trains on the Red Grange barnstorming tour. She was 95 in Canton, Ohio, attending the post-midnight Hall of Fame enshrinement party for Brian Urlacher. And when you wrap your brain around those things, you're like, wow, like this woman literally witnessed just about every step of Bears history. And not only that, in that visit that she had with us on the podcast, she could recall some of this stuff in incredibly vivid detail into her 90s in a way that was just remarkable.
Yeah, I remember early in my career, I did a story once on on an 86-year-old man who was the bat boy for the 06-08 Cubs. And I remember reflecting on that and saying, man, I wish I had gotten more out of that, and gotten more reflections. And I feel the same way about Virginia, because like you said, she wasn't just kind of along for the ride. She really witnessed everything and remembered everything and had great, I wish personally, I had taken better advantage of that to get more, because she had a lot to offer as far as she was, Bears history and a direct link to it. So, so I feel, I feel a little melancholy about that. But again, I think I said from the top, a life well lived and a life to be celebrated. And I think she'll be remembered as just the classy woman that she was, and the great representative of the Bears and Chicago.
Before we move on, I'll give you a couple nuggets from that podcast from 2019 that may strike you. Virginia McCaskey was in attendance at the 1932 NFL championship game, which was the league's first ever postseason game. And it was cold and snowy in Chicago. And this was at a time where the league was still attracting fans and needed to sell them on why they should come to a game. And so they moved that football game indoors, as you well know, to the Chicago Stadium. I think it was the Portsmouth Spartans they played and beat 9-0 on a Nagurski to Grange touchdown pass. Think about that for a second. But the ticket stub that Virginia McCaskey collected from one of her cousins was for $1.25 in the second balcony for the NFL championship game. And she also always said that she recalled the odor of that game because it was at the Chicago Stadium just after the circus left town.
Yeah, I mean, and I've read other stories. I know Pat Finley sometimes talked to her, I think in 2018 or 2019, and very many of the same reflections. And so I kind of want to go back and see, because I know other people have interviewed her and talked about it. I feel like I kind of missed that didn't get enough of the Bears history from that. But that's, that is firsthand knowledge of the Bears. And that's what really makes it so great. That, like I said, the direct link to George Halas, who, a founding father of not only the Bears, but of the NFL.
She took the train from Drexel University as a college student in 1940 to that championship game where the Bears beat Washington 73-0. She was at Wrigley Field when the Bears beat the Giants 14-10 in 1963. Her biggest memory of that game was that her daughter Anne, because of the limited ticket supply that the family had to that game, gave her ticket away willingly to younger brother George, who at the time was 6 years old. And that really left an impression on Virginia that her daughter was so generous and willing to do that. But that's the other part of this, Mark. Like the family has been a punching bag, and justifiably so, during Bears failures for the longest time. And we know the infamous post 2013 quote from George that his mother was pissed off and tired of the sustained mediocrity that the team had. But the other universal thing that comes out of people that have been part of that organization and people like us that have been around it is that the family is very kind and very gracious and very big-hearted. And so that shouldn't be lost in all of this, that the mother, the top of this family tree, this woman with 11 children, 9 still surviving, and 40 grandchildren, I think 24 great-grandchildren, put together a family that is just remarkably full of good people.
Yeah, you can argue that, she was the owner of the Bears, but I think her greatest achievement, she raised them right. I remember, I remember even in like November, I was, we park in a parking lot at Halas Hall that is a little distant from the
Yeah.
actual building, so we have to walk in, and it was an unusually cold day in Halas Hall, and I'm start walking from my car towards Halas Hall, and a car kind of cuts me off and is in front of me and rolls down the window, says, "Come on, get in." I said, "No, no, I'm good. I'm good." "No, no, 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 get in, get in." It was George McCaskey giving me a lift to Halas Hall. That's the kind of people the McCaskeys are. Which is what makes it very difficult to criticize them as owners of the Bears. But I mean, that's our job. So you're right. It's an interesting, very interesting conflict of really liking people, rooting for them to succeed, but also having to report on their failures. So it's I don't know. Somebody with better kind of psychological acuity than me can figure that out, but it is a very difficult thing.
I believe that Virginia McCaskey's visitation and funeral will be early next week. I think it was Tuesday that I saw that they'll be doing that. So it will be a celebration of a life well lived, and one obviously that will celebrate the ultimate Bears historian, Virginia McCaskey. And I did mention that 1940 championship game. You were in your second year at the Sun-Times at that point, right?
Oh, I wish. I wish. You have no idea how much I wish I was there for all those events.
For all the good ones, right?
Yeah.
So we'll flip the page now and get into the next version of championship Bears teams that are coming. I do want to let the audience in on a bit that they're probably well aware of, and I need you to explain it a little bit because we're going to talk about a couple things that relate to it. But you have an ongoing bit on the social media platform X, where when the celebration of a certain milestone or event gets a little bit too big, you take a graphic. I believe it's a newspaper graphic from the Sun-Times. I did write down that it always includes the parade route, and it says the parade begins at 10:30 a.m. at Washington Street and Des Plaines Avenue, and you use this consistently to commemorate something that the masses on social media are over celebrating. Am I correct on all that?
Yes, yes. The David Montgomery jump cut in a preseason game for a touchdown in 2019 that even Matt Nagy chided us for making a big deal of. That's the kind of thing when people, we're so Bears fans and all sports fans, and all fans, you always cling to whatever you can for hope. And so whenever, especially in Chicago where we haven't won as much or seen as many winning teams, there's always any little hope, that a running backs coach is tough on people is wow. Well, that'll make a difference. I mean, so yeah. So
that was an August celebration this year, right? Hard Knocks.
Yes.
Chad Morton was really getting on those guys.
Yes, and Eric Bieniemy as well, right?
Yeah.
So here we are again. So anyway, that's the root of that. I hope I haven't overused it, but yeah, we just celebrate things that really we shouldn't be celebrating, and that's where that starts.
So there's a rule in comedy. It's an unwritten rule, and I will credit a friend of mine in Minneapolis, Joe Haugh, for this one. Is that if you ever overuse a bit, the key to it is to keep overusing it. Like that's the way to make sure that it doesn't become like overused in an annoying way, that it just becomes overused in a hilarious way. And so don't ever fear that you've overused that bit. That bit has got years of shelf life left on it. And I bring that up because the Bears are likely planning the parade route for a three-peat, not the kind of three-peat that the Kansas City Chiefs are going for on Sunday in Super Bowl LIX. The Bears are going for an offseason three-peat. This could be the third consecutive year that the Bears are champions of the offseason. 2022, we had the huge trade of the number one pick that netted DJ Moore and so many draft selections that the Bears were going to turn into a championship football team. In 2023, they got the number one pick from that Panthers trade and turned it into the generational quarterback named Caleb Williams. And this year now, they landed the head coach in the hiring cycle that everybody wanted, Ben Johnson. And so this is potentially an offseason three-peat.
This is the best win of them all. This is the one that gives the most legitimate reason. And it's interesting you mentioned that you bring that up because for the last 2 years, I think I said the same thing, and I will say it again, is it's okay to be excited about this. I mean, this is not false. I mean, 2 years ago, I said the same thing. Last year, I definitely said you won't be looking. I said if these things fail, you will not be looking back and saying, "What was I thinking?" I know exactly what I was thinking. They had DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and a number one quarterback and an offensive line that led the league in rushing and a defense that was number one in the NFL in points over the last 8 games, absolutely there was reason to be excited about the Bears. They should have been. They should have been better. And so you're not. It's not the kind of celebration that you look back and you say, "Man, that was really dumb. That was really stupid of me," which we've done before. Hoping that things that never could have happened would happen. But I think this is the best of them all. The biggest reason for optimism because let's face it, the Bears got it right with Ben Johnson, and they got it right with the guy who hired the right defensive coordinator. Everything on paper is right. And so I think there's every reason. So I'll say the same thing.
Yeah.
I think I think the division will probably kind of tamp down expectations a little bit. I don't think I'll go higher than 8-9 or 9-8 because of that. But I will say if they end up being 5-12 or whatever, I'm not going to go back thinking, wondering, wow, what was I thinking of that? Because I know exactly what I'm thinking. The Bears should be a really good team this year and certainly next with what they have.
I've said that, mirroring my thoughts with Caleb Williams in 2024, that Ben Johnson may not work out as the Bears head coach, but that doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. These were dice worth rolling, just as they were dice worth rolling on Caleb Williams a year ago. And now the trick is trying to turn those dice rolls into a profit and turn them into success and turn them into something that can be sustained. And so it's going to be really interesting here in the months ahead for us to be kind of in the early stages of seeing how Ben Johnson gets this program off the ground. He's got a lot of work ahead of him. He's never been a head coach before at any level. He's got to figure out how to budget his time. He's got to figure out how to deploy his assistants in ways that bring out productivity as quickly as possible in the entire football team. And I guess when you left that introductory press conference in Lake Forest a couple weeks ago, what did you find most impressive about his presentation and some of the credentials that he walked in the door with?
Well, I like the fact that he feels like he can take whatever he's got to work with and build an offense around that. I thought that was because that's going to change. Even if he has success with the Bears, that will change, and you need to be able to do that. I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about him or how much of his success was due to being in the right place at the right time. And so I am a little not skeptical, but certainly just, backing off a little bit. I'll be honest, I wasn't as impressed as everybody else about him winning the press conference. I mean, to me, maybe because I've seen too many of these. So
no doubt.
I can't go in there and say there were too many things differently. He said, and I know we've talked about it. I think we both even had the same exact tweet independently of each other about his bring your track shoes moment. What was the line he used? Be comfortable.
Yeah, get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable. And we both said, independent of each other, that was his bring your track shoes moment, which was a Matt Eberflus thing, and many of the things, a little bit unique tweak of the Packers, but he had that. A lot of things that I considered cliche. It doesn't mean I don't think he'll be good. I'm just saying I wasn't as enamored with it. I've reached a point where almost anything I have to see it to believe it. So
it's the right stage.
I think there's a lot there, and frankly, I think as much as they got it right, I think it'll be interesting to see how much this really. I don't know if this really changed the way they do business at Haugh. And that, with regard to kind of the dysfunction and stuff like that, the Bears have never really been the kind of organizations under McCaskey rule that has had the intuition to know that, like an Andy Reid, to hire an Andy Reid when he was just a quarterback coach, or Mike Tomlin when he was just a 1-year defensive coordinator, or a John Harbaugh when he was a special team. They've never been that. Well, that really didn't change. That part of the process really didn't change. You and I could have identified Ben Johnson as the number one guy. And then when you bring in the guy and he says, I want this job, that makes it kind of easy. So I don't think the process has changed as much. I think their motivation changed. I think they reached after a year of tumult, another year of tumult. I think they reached a point where they said, hey, we've got to get this right. We've got to get the right guy. And they're kind of like, it's like when you go to the track and you handicap your own races and it doesn't work out and you lose money. And then all of a sudden, the next time you go, you get a racing form, but you also get a tip sheet. You know? And I think they got a tip sheet, and they got the guy that everybody else identified and the guy everybody else wanted, and finally got to that point. The one difference in that analogy is when the Bears don't get it right, they still make money. So they're a little slower to get to that motivation. And I think they finally got there with Kevin Warren's push.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they took the other step of paying more than the Bears will ever pay, more than anybody's ever paid. And that's the difference. That's where I kind of push back on the notion that the Bears could have gotten might have gotten Ben Johnson last year, because I don't think they were in the same spot last year. They
No,
were a lot different. They at this time last year, they were thinking they're getting it right. They were thinking they're doing it right. They didn't feel that desperation, and that's why they kept Eberflus. Now, a whole year later, they had that desperation. Say, hey, we've got to do something.
no
And
doubt.
that included paying $13 million to a coach who's never been a head coach in the NFL.
The big splash was without question needed, and I do credit Kevin Warren for understanding that he had to push to make sure that big splash did happen. What I do agree with you, and we'll stay here for a minute since you brought it up, is the Bears' process to getting a head coach hired was very much scrutinized, in pockets heavily criticized. They ended up talking and announcing interviews with 17 known candidates. There's believed to be maybe one or two others that talked about the job, and it wasn't announced. They ended up hiring their first choice, and the guy everybody went in, including you and I, saying that they should hire. So had they only interviewed Ben Johnson and Todd Monken and two others, the process leads to the same result, and you would have said, "Oh, it's a victory," And so it's this kind of outcome bias that clouds the picture of this. I don't know that you and I have ever unpacked it in terms of what you thought about those several weeks of the wide net cast and what the Bears thought they were getting out of it. One of the things I've pushed back on, and this is not a criticism, if the Bears believe they got valuable information out of those other 16 candidates to help them become a better football franchise, I'm all for it. What I tried to do was just kind of lower the volume on how significant that stuff was, because in 2022, they went out and talked to 24 people in general manager and head coaching interviews, and then spent 3 seasons in last place in the NFC North. So if they learned all these things from all these candidates, it would have resulted in results on the football field. It didn't. It hasn't. I'm just curious, when you reflect back on it, results aside, what you made of the entirety of the process that led them to the coach that everybody wanted them to get.
Well, at the beginning of the process, Dan, I said that, and I wrote this, that I think the Bears should just take the biggest swing they could and just talk to the 5 best guys. It would have been like Vrabel and Carroll and Ben Johnson and Joe Brady, and just the top 5 guys, and get one. That way, you're going to get one. You're going to get a guy, and I think that's what. But I feel, I'll be honest, what my take on it was that I think the first part of the process was a Bears process. That's the way they like to do things. The last part of the process is as if like the 49ers came in and started handling things, or a team that actually knows what they're doing came in and said, okay, we've done they've done all the Bear stuff. Now a team that knows about winning kind of replaced them and came in. So they kind of morphed into, what they probably should be. And I thought that was like the second part of the process. So yeah, I don't begrudge them that. Like I said, I think they should have just talked to those 5 guys, but if the end result is what matters most, and they finally got there, and the Bears don't always get there. They hardly ever get to that point. So I think the process worked for both, for them, because they got to do it their way. And then they did it kind of the right way.
I was going to say, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying the first part of the process was kind of like a handoff to a center who's doubling as a fullback near the goal line minus the fumble. And ultimately, the end result was lining up with 3 tight ends and every big lineman you have, and just handing the football to a running back and saying, get that 1 yard no matter how hard it takes.
Yes, in the end, they played football.
Yeah. and they got their score. So we'll see what happens with Ben Johnson in the months ahead. The one question that will kind of linger here throughout this offseason is how quickly he can get a productive working relationship with general manager Ryan Poles. There was a lot of questions going into the hiring process on how Poles' presence heading into his 4th season as a general manager would impact some of the candidates. There were some candidates that were a little bit reticent to sign on to work for a general manager who had made so many major missteps over the first 3 years. Ben Johnson had information. He essentially said his agent, Rick Smith, gave him a presentation. And then in 30 minutes at the start of his Zoom interview with the Bears, he felt a comfort level with Ryan Poles that sold him. I, through very Mark Potash-like cynical eyes, looked at that and said, how much can you really learn about a person in 30 minutes over Zoom? And that there's a lot more to learn about their working relationship in the months ahead. But it's a very important working relationship, because a certain level of authority has to be distributed here. And every general manager and head coach tandem can talk about how in lockstep they are. We lived that for the first year of Ryan Pace and John Fox. Those guys were locked at the hip, as they would say at Halas Hall, and they were good buddies, and they were making all the right decisions. And by the time they were starting their 3rd season together, their relationship was permanently fractured, right? And so these things can go down many different paths. But I'm curious what your curiosities are about how this power structure evolves and how very specifically the relationship between Ryan and Ben has to take shape for the Bears to be successful.
Well, first of all, Dan, let me take one step back and just say that I think there's it's interesting to me, like you say, about how easily Ben Johnson was sold on the Bears. I'm a little skeptical of that when a guy comes in. I think you felt the same way. I know I've talked to other people who have. I thought Ben Johnson was one of those things where the questions he had for them were more important than the questions they had for him.
Right.
And I thought he would be a little more, a guy that hot, I thought would be a little more skeptical of like, hey, why have all these other coaches and GMs failed? What is it about this? I thought he'd be more convinced. And when he goes in and says, I want this job, I don't think he's allowing himself to really get those things answered. There's a lot of confirmation bias when you already want a job and you're going to hear what you want to hear. And so I think it's still it's almost like to me it's like one of those literary conflicts. It's man versus his environment. You've got a guy who I think David said on the previous episode of Take the North, and I know John Greenberg has said this. You've got a guy in Ben Johnson who makes people better. And he's working in an environment, which I have argued, and I think is true, that makes people worse.
Yeah.
And so I still think it remains to be seen, even though Ben Johnson is the right guy, whether Haugh will change him before he changes Haugh, which I think is a big key. So I think that's number one. I think that's still in doubt. I think we're still going to have to see that, whether he's the guy, whether the Bears get the guy who called the stumble bum play or the guy who called the end around to Jameson Williams that turned into a bad interception. There are two sides to even the best guys. There are two sides, and Haugh always seems to bring out the worst. And so we'll see if he can break that trend. As far as his relationship with Ryan Poles, I think that's kind of interesting to me in that I think that's kind of the way things are going, is this undefined partnership with a GM and a coach. You see it in San Francisco. You see it with McVay in LA. And these things, we always expect things to be delineated, like perfectly explained to us, like, okay, who has the power? If two guys, if one guy wants a running back and the other guy wants an offensive lineman at number 10 or 9, whatever pick they have, who do they take? But I think in the NFL today, and I think this is the way it's going to work out, is where it's much more of a partnership. And I don't think Ryan Poles is much Ben Johnson's boss as he is his partner. And I think they're going to try and forge this kind of relationship which definitely works in LA, works in San Francisco, works in other places. I think Buffalo, where it's kind of the new thing. And I think the Bears are going to go for that. I think that's the way it's going to be. I think Ben Johnson's going to have much more influence on Ryan Poles and on personnel than the previous coaches have had, or the previous coach had. And I think Ryan Poles is good with that. I'm not certain of that, but I think he's comfortable. I sense that he's comfortable with that. So it'll be interesting to see. It's been proved. That's kind of the way things are going in the NFL. And whenever the Bears do something that also has worked for other teams, I think that's a good thing. Just like picking the hot prospect as the hot coordinator as your coach.
Well, and Rick Smith, Ben Johnson's agent, who did multiple interviews, he did one with Bill Zimmerman, he did one with the Score, he did one with Peggy Kaczynski. That the inferences that I took away from those 3 interviews was that the Johnson camp established how important his vision is toward the direction of the franchise, and that it must be the most important vision in the building, which means that Ryan Poles has to sort of find that rhythm and that stride alongside Ben Johnson, as opposed to vice versa. And that's meaningful, because it does put a lot of responsibility and pressure on a first-time head coach to understand where he wants to go and how he wants to get there. And it requires him to not only attain the buy-in, but continue the buy-in from his general manager, so that they can continue a partnership that is productive. I do think that Ryan has it in him to not be sort of, jilted by this or embittered by this in any way, to go out along and try to provide a championship stride. But there's a lot to this. And I it comes down to like, who's at the steering wheel. And in my opinion, at this point, it seems like all of the things that we've heard, both through public channels and back channels, is that Ben Johnson has been put in the driver's seat, and Ryan Poles will be right there in the shotgun seat to help him navigate, but that the steering wheel and the gas pedal are right in front of Ben Johnson.
I agree. And I think there's going to be instances where, as much as Ben Johnson says he can make an offense out of anybody, I think there's going to be some instances where he'll say there might be an established player on the Bears who says, that guy can't play for me. Not that he's a bad player, but he just can't play for me. And I think that player is more likely now to be let go or trade or whatever, moved now with Ben Johnson than it would have been with Matt Eberflus. The only problem with that is like the one instance we have in Chicago of that happening was when an offensive coordinator, Mike Martz, could not play with
Greg
Greg
Olson.
Olson, and he was traded, and it turned into a huge disaster. So there, as usual, it sounds like the right thing to do in this day and age, but our only reference point is just absolute disaster. So who knows how it's going to work out? But the point being, I agree that I think Ben Johnson's going to have a lot more. I think Ben Johnson's going to have a lot more say about who can play for him and who can't, and whether that guy stays or not. And B, I think Ryan Poles is good with that. I think he seems like, I've always liked Poles. I think his makeup is really good. It's been disappointing that he had such a bad year, but I think his makeup is good. And I think part of that is that I think he will kind of realize that this is a good setup for him as well as the Bears. If you're truly interested in what's best for the Chicago Bears, sometimes you have to be, sacrifice and give a little bit of yourself. And that's what he's going to have to do to make this thing work.
One last thing before we pivot into some Super Bowl talk. The Bears have now, since you and I have been side by side on this beat, had 5 introductory press conferences for Bears coaches, from Trestman to Fox to Nagy to Eberflus to now Ben Johnson. Those are all guys that came in with a certain level of hype attached to them, and then the previous 4, only Matt Nagy was able to reach the playoffs. With that, you typically get this reboot setting where the fresh, sober eyes on a roster can change the way a roster is shaped. And I'm curious how this is going to evolve here in the months ahead as Ben Johnson sort of goes position by position, player by player, and determines who fits here and who doesn't, how this roster may change and some of the surprises that might be there. But you've obviously experienced this before. You always see some surprises and some developments and some evolution in the way the roster is constructed that you maybe weren't ready for because you don't really know the philosophies or the views of the guy that's coming in to lead it. And that's going to be interesting for us, I guess, in the months ahead to take a pulse of.
And I think the key thing there is kind of the overarching factor with this is that there's just more trust in a guy who's done this before, at least offensively, as a play caller, as a play calling offensive coordinator who's done this. So there's a little more trust that he's right. I guess one of the key guys would be DeAndre Swift, who, was let go in Detroit, and maybe not because he couldn't play, maybe because they had a better option in Gibbs. But let's see if I imagine they'll have to keep him for a year. Let's see what he does with a guy who he at least upgraded when he was in Detroit. And so that's one. It's one. I mean, there's going to be others. It's a good point to see how this shakes out. But and also the fact that they have the huge exception of the offensive line, they still have a lot to work with.
Oh gosh.
This quarterback obviously was the factor. I'm convinced it was the reason why he said I want this job is because of the quarterback. And so he's got that to start out with, and you've got Keenan Allen's kind of in limbo, but you still got at least 2 good receivers, running back. I mean, you've got the makings. This isn't a rebuild of the offense. It'll be interesting to see if it's as far as personnel wise, if it is. Yeah. But it will be interesting to see how he does. And like I said, I think Swift will be one key guy to see what he can do with him. A guy who he didn't have any use for in Detroit, but certainly does here, or should here. Yeah. And so we'll see. But again, it goes by there's a lot of trust and a lot of trust, but a lot of faith in Ben Johnson that he'll do this because it's an offensive guy, and we just haven't had those in Chicago where guys come with this much credibility.
Proven credibility.
That's the difference. That's the difference with Matt Nagy. I would argue that his sustained success is greater than Mark Trestman, and who came with a much larger NFL resume. So I think this is I would say, and I know this probably wasn't the question, but I would say that Ben Johnson to the Bears and with their current situation, this is the best. And I know we hate to say this after that last year with the best situation for a quarterback, but I would argue, even that said, this is the best situation a first-year quarterback has had since Ditka. I think because you've got an offensive guy in a league where, as they pointed out, it's all about the quarterback and the coach quarterback, like the in basketball with the coach and point guard. It's like it's critical, and that trumps like Lovey was probably might have been just as highly regarded. Dave Wanstead certainly was more highly regarded, but they were defensive coaches, and it's a lot different. Having an offensive guy with this kind of credibility is different than having a defensive guy with the credibility that Wani and Lovey had coming in. So I would argue that this is, again, going back to the original thing about reasons for optimism and why you shouldn't feel like, gee, what was I thinking, is that this is the best situation for a first-year head coach that the Bears have had since Ditka. So there's every reason to be optimistic. I won't push back against optimism, but I will push back against people pushing back against skepticism.
That's a deep entangled web there. The punctuation on your point about Ben Johnson coming here because of Caleb Williams, I think, is a good one. He also, I think the first thing he mentioned in his introductory press conference, that the reason he wanted to come here was this place. I believe that was the very number one thing that he mentioned, which is Chicago. And people always forget that no matter how bad the Bears are, there's an attraction and a magnetism to Chicago because people in the league understand the passion of this city. They understand how football crazed this environment is, and that if you are the person that can unlock that secret world to sustain success, that you are going to live as a legend for the rest of your life. And so I think that's part of why Ben Johnson's here, and part of why he started that Zoom call saying, I want this job. And so he wants this job in part because he wants to bring the Bears to where the Lions couldn't get to this year. And so we'll pivot on that to the Super Bowl, because the Super Bowl 59 will be played Sunday in New Orleans. Chiefs, Eagles. Couple rapid fire questions for you as we sort of examine this game. But I know you and I joked, again, we're going to circle back to that parade route graphic earlier this week when your colleague Patrick Finley at the Sun-Times got Saquon Barkley to talk about his flirtations with the Bears in free agency last year. And I believe Saquon said that he was, quote unquote, pretty damn close to signing with the Bears.
Yes.
I thought it was a good get from a reporter on the scene in New Orleans to be able to float that out to the masses. What I struggled with was the interpretation of it. Okay, so what, right? Like, that's the next question of that. And so that's where I kind of on Twitter used your bit, took that parade route and said, am I doing this right? Because I don't know what type of commemoration or celebration or acknowledgement or whatever it may be the Bears should get for finishing second to the Eagles in the Saquon Barkley sweepstakes.
Well, yeah, but and that's one of those necessary stories almost, just like the whole everybody pushing back on the whole Nagy thing. You just have to go to that. And so, I guess my feeling on that is I didn't think it was much of a possibility at the time, but I buy that, to tell you the truth. I mean, I won't celebrate it. I don't think. I mean, I get your point, but I think it was portrayed as being leverage. I think in Hard Knocks I think that's
yeah, the
right.
offseason one, yeah.
But again, it just I think more is just that it's so typical of the Bears that they almost had
the offensive player of the year, right?
They came also close to drafting Joe Montana. It's another draft. That's a draft room story. One of the great draft room stories of all time. How the Bears were all, Jim Finks of all people, ready to take Joe Montana, got taken off the board at the last second for Willie McClendon.
I mean, it also opens up the door for the conversation on whether Saquon Barkley would have had 2,000 yards running behind Nate Davis in September.
Well,
you know what I mean? And like one of the reasons he chose to play in Philadelphia is because they were a better football team with a better offensive line. The decision was right. He gets to play for the Lombardi Trophy on Sunday.
These are not modular entities. You can't place the 2,000 yards or whatever he ended up getting with Philly and say, well, he would have done that here. Just no more than you could say that Patrick Mahomes would be, one of the, possibly the greatest quarterback of all time had the Bears drafted him. So there's always, I guess, things like that, especially with the Bears. They always seem to, come up.
And by the way, the Eagles also have a defensive tackle who's young and in his prime, and the Bears chose not to pick and traded out of the number 9 pick and let
that's
Jalen Carter
an even more interesting thing, because the Bears got a pretty good right tackle for it,
and a punter,
right? So I mean, they got, so that's not as that's I don't think that's as big a point of contention, at least right now. We'll see, but yeah, it's always fun to point that out, because that's great trolling material.
My last question for you is 2 parts, and it's going to start with the defensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles, because we got to see in 2018 Vic Fangio at his absolute best, with pieces to work with, and an ability to connect with those players and in a way to bring out success in which that 2018 Bears defense was dominant. It's an overused adjective, but that defense was dominant. Led the league in takeaways, led the league in points allowed, and really just put their stamp on a championship season. And so I've been excited this week to see Vic get some of his flowers, to be back in the Super Bowl. I think it's just the second time in his 4 decades in the league that he's played in this game. I'm curious what you make of kind of his fingerprints on this Eagles defense, and whether your lasting memories of Vic from here in Chicago are like mine, where you have an added appreciation for the way he goes about his job in a way that creates success for his players.
Well, Vic Fangio is my favorite coach I've ever dealt with in any sport or whatever. I mean, he's good. He's very good at what he does. He's old school with the old school sweats. Any guy who wears old school sweats is going to be number one in
August, like a hooded sweatshirt on like the hottest training camp practices in August. Vic was the same.
And also, I'll be honest, getting back to what we were talking before, he was the one guy who was immune to Halas Hall dysfunction. He was the guy who was the best version of himself. With the one guy of everybody they've hired since Lovie Smith and Jerry Angelo were fired, he's the one guy who has come in here and has been the absolute best version of himself. So and it's so typical, if you know Vic, you know that he's not going to be affected by anything, except for one play, putting Cravon LeBlanc on Jordy Nelson in a key moment. That was his one Halas Hall moment. And except for that, he was just his own guy and the same guy. And I also appreciate that about him. But Vic is a really just not only a great coach, but a great guy and a great sports fan. We had a lot of fun with that while he was here.
A lot of baseball talk.
He's a regular guy. He's the kind of guy that, I always have difficulty in my whole career. I've always had difficulty connecting with people. I'm just difficult socially. But Vic was one guy who I could do that with, because he was such a good regular guy. He grew up, if he wasn't a coach, he'd be just like us. He was the same kind of sports fan, has the same kind of passion. And that's why I like him. And that's why I'm rooting for him to finally get that. Dave Tobe, I always like Dave Tobe too, another one of my favorite coaches. But he's got, 3 of these?
Yeah.
So that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, he's good.
And as much attention, deservedly, that Spagnuolo has gotten since becoming a coordinator of the Chiefs. He also has gotten rewarded with, I think, 2, right? So 1 or 2.
Yeah.
So it's kind of Vic's turn. And though I'm picking the Chiefs only because they just always find a way in these games, and there's nobody who can really match their mental toughness, gumption, whatever it is that carries them. I really hope that I'm really hoping that the Eagles can pull it off because of Vic Fangio, because I think he deserves to have that. He doesn't need the validation. He doesn't think that, but that would be nice validation for what a great career in the NFL.
On the Score on Wednesday morning, I encouraged that audience, and I'll encourage this audience to get to the Philadelphia Eagles social media account. They did a thing earlier this week where Vic Fangio answered questions that were sent in by fans. And if you miss Vic and you miss his dry wit and his ability to be really direct and to the point very quickly with his answers to questions, you're going to want to use those couple minutes to watch him on that clip. That's very fun. So I'll get you out of here on this. You made your pick, the Chiefs. I'm picking the Eagles, and I am already regretting it. It's Thursday morning or Friday morning here, and I'm already regretting picking the Eagles in this football game. But the question is, what is the Mahomes factor, and can it be tamed? Because Patrick Mahomes seems to have a knack for the postseason, and whenever the big moments arise, you can almost feel through your TV set the swell of belief of both the players that he has around him, and then the swell of doubt from the team that he's going against, being like, oh God, it's Mahomes time. So how would you describe his magic in those moments and whether it can be tamed this Sunday?
Well, Dan, when I covered the Blackhawks throughout their Stanley Cup run, I came up with a story, a theme of the uncanniness of Jonathan Taves, about how things just seem to. It's like what Ron Wolf said about Brett Favre. The field tilts, the ice tilts his way when he's on it, I covered a lot of those Blackhawks championships throughout the whole run there, and I see many of the same things. Things just work their way. Patrick Kane had an injury, and it allowed the Bears and it opened a loophole, the one loophole in a very strict salary cap, long-term injured reserve, to sign Antoine Vermette and Kimo Timonen and Andrew Desjardins, and that made the difference in the Hawks winning. So winning the cup in 15. So that that negative play turned into a positive. Saw the same thing last week with the Chiefs. So when a penalty, they committed a penalty that goaded Buffalo into trying a 2-point conversion, ended up being a 3-point difference for the way the game played out. And instead of it being 31-31 at the end, it was 31-28. So on that key fourth down, in a tie game, they never would have even tried that. They just would have punted because they were, they wouldn't want to have given the Chiefs a chance. So my point is, negatives turn into positives.
Yep.
And that's mystical. I can't think, ever since Patrick Mahomes became the quarterback. Got to remember, before Patrick Mahomes, in the playoff game before that, the ball's bouncing off of Mariota's chest back to himself for a touchdown, right? And
right.
You had the sack of Mariota, where it was negated by a ridiculous forward motion. His forward motion was stopped on a sack. I mean, Kelsey got hurt in that game in the first half, and that made things a lot tougher for Nagy in the second half. Those things don't happen to the Chiefs anymore, right?
Right.
The ball bounces their way. The shortest punt, the second shortest punt they had in the postseason last year, turned into gold when it hit a 49ers player, and it turned into a turnover that led to a touchdown they absolutely needed. Dre Greenlaw tears his Achilles, ruptures his Achilles, running onto the field. How does this happen? I mean, why do these things? This has only happened since Mahomes became the quarterback, and I'm not saying that he like he is some Jedi mind trick or whatever, but all I'm saying is I've seen that special quality in teams and players, like I saw with the Blackhawks. I see that in the Chiefs, where the Red Sea parts for them.
It becomes psychological too on both sides, and I think that's part of the point you're making is that every little thing seems magnified in a Chiefs game.
And I always say, another thing I've always said is nobody makes you play stupid like Patrick Mahomes. He goads you. It's like the Brady factor.
Yep.
Like Brady somehow got Kyle Shanahan to drop back in a key moment when all he needed was a field goal for a 2-score game, right? That would have clinched the field. No, he's got to drop back, get sacked, then a holding penalty. All of a sudden, you're out of field goal range. That's the fear of Tom Brady, I guess.
But he makes you feel he's gonna say he makes you feel the magnitude of the moment, right? Like
Mahomes is taking that mantle from Brady. Before it was Brady, it was like, remember when D Ford lined up off sides for the Chiefs in the championship game, AFC championship game against the Patriots?
Yeah.
Brady just compels you to play stupid, right? That was an interception that should have clinched the game. And so the Chiefs used to be the victim of it. But now, since that's been passed from Brady to Mahomes, now all of a sudden, now it's Mahomes who makes you play stupid and just makes you make mistakes. There's one play I remember 2 years ago in the Super Bowl. I think it was the most consequential false start in the history of the Super Bowl, where it was like second quarter. The Eagles had all the momentum, remember, early in that game. And it was Sayamalo, the right guard, on a 3rd and 1. They're ready to push for the first down, and he commits what you would think was just a false start. Well, the next play, it changes the play. They run a different play. They fumble. It's returned for a touchdown by the Chiefs, and totally takes away all the momentum. I didn't say it made the difference again, but it totally turned. Little things become big when the Chiefs are involved, and things like that happen. It's like another thing, like the Chiefs. I'm sorry to go on like this. I hope we're not overdue for a break. But anyway, they're like, it's like, things just happen for the Chiefs where, like, the Chiefs 2 years ago, when the salary cap robs you of special teams. That's one of the things that hurts. You get hurt on special teams because your depth is bad. Well, the Chiefs had the 31st ranked special teams that year, 2 years ago, when they faced the Eagles. But they just happen to be facing the 32nd ranked special teams.
Yeah,
and of course, Kadarius Toney has like some big
the return.
Kick return or punt return that clinches the game. So they've always been in the right spot. Another thing was, I mentioned this in my pick for the game, how they always compel you to like play against yourself. Is like the Chiefs, the 49ers had the lead at halftime. Okay. They had 3 possessions with the lead, and they're facing the 18th ranked rushing defense in the NFL. And they have Christian McCaffrey on their side, and they rush in those 3 possessions. They rush McCaffrey 1 time.
Yeah. Right.
1 time. That's playing stupid. Why does Kyle
It's
Shanahan
the
like
magnitude of the
gold
moment.
standard, right?
It's feeling tight. It's feeling like you need
And
to do
so
more than you need to. And
so
and
it's
that's
just so I guess that's a very long-winded way. I apologize for that. A long-winded way of saying things just happen. It's special. The Chiefs, just like I always say, the Blackhawks will win cups again, but never like they did in that era. It was special. And the same thing about the Chiefs. A team will have a run like them, but not quite like this because there's something about them. And it relates, I guess, to Mahomes. It started with Mahomes. He was, before Mahomes, Andy Reid was the coach who couldn't win the big one, right? I mean, he had a totally different, he had a good reputation, but a
now he's
totally
got them
different
all.
reputation that he had before Mahomes got here, even with the Chiefs. And so now he's like greatest of all time, right? If he wins this one, he might even, he's
up there.
Belichick.
He's definitely up on the list. And look, like this is it. Now we've given people Mark, we've given people a glimpse behind the curtain at Haugh of the interactions I get to have with you every day for 6 months during the football season. We started the podcast talking about a trip through history via Virginia McCaskey's eyes. And now we just got a full oral history of the Chiefs dynasty here in the last 10 minutes of the Take the North podcast. You've got the Chiefs winning, and I've got the Eagles winning, and we'll see what happens. One of these teams next week will have a parade in their respective city
and earn it.
They will have earned it. And you've earned it. You've earned a invitation to come back on the podcast whenever you want. We always get a kick out of it, Grody, Studs, and I, that whenever we put out a call for mailbag questions, your envelope shows up in the mailbox as fast as anybody's. You've always got a question for Take the North, and so we thought it would be good to ask you several here on this edition. This is the Illinois Sports Writer of the Year, Mark Potash. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Thanks, Dan. I had a good time.
Always do. That's Mark Potash. I'm Dan Wiederer. For our producer, Adam Sinsinski. This is the Take the North podcast. Great talk. See you out there.